I'm out here in the garage for another garage video. I recently got this new icon for the garage gym. Jesus falls the first time, and it's just, I put it right there in the squat rack behind me, and when you're squatting or deadlifting on your last set, it's okay to fail. You know, you're supposed to fail. Jesus fell 3 times. So in order to grow in the spiritual life, in order to grow physically, it's okay to fail on that go for that last rep and go a failure when you're hitting heavy squats. So it's kind of the perfect icon. Pretty hyped about that. But in this video, I'm going to be talking about the Divine Comedy by Ď Alighieri. I read this, and it was kind of a long grind, because right here I got the Longfellow translation, and I would not recommend that. It's kind of written in Old English, and it's way hard to read. It took me probably 8 or 9 months to read through the whole thing, because I just kept losing momentum. It's just so difficult to read the Old English version. I've heard the Anthony Esolen version is very good. I'd recommend that probably. But for those who are not in the know, Dante and the Divine Comedy is part of a lineage of what's known as epic poetry. So the epics are, there's kind of this progression and lineage of epic poetry, which is the Iliad, then the Odyssey, then the Aeneid, written by Virgil, and the Iliad and Odyssey were written by Homer, and then the Divine Comedy. And then next up is for me to read Milton's Paradise Lost by John Milton. And I've heard some people say that Moby Dick is kind of another epic poem, but I'm not sure. But my goal is to read through all the epics, and it's been kind of a long journey to read through all of those so far and kind of like process them. The Divine Comedy is probably the hardest one I've read thus far as well, partially because of the translation, but also because it's so multifaceted. There's so much going on. I want to talk a little bit about it. So, a little bit of background. So the Divine Comedy is kind of subdivided into Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. Most people are familiar with Inferno. A lot of people have read it, in high school. But basically, Ď Alighieri, he finished writing this in 1321. So this is kind of a Middle Ages classic. And each of the different parts has 33 cantos, or I think a canto is like a song, or it's like a division of poetry. So Inferno is the journey of Dante going through the different circles of hell, traveling through hell with Virgil, Virgil wrote the Aeneid, and Dante idolized Virgil, and they traveled down through the various circles of hell. And each of the circles of hell has like a different sin associated with it. For example, the circle of hell, which is lust, is the people who are in the circle of hell for lust. They're being constantly like battered by a wind and blown around because they were blown around by their passions in life, and they couldn't control themselves. They allowed their passions to blow them all over the place, and so that's their corresponding punishment in hell, is that they're being blown around in the wind forever. And he goes into each of the sins and kind of has a corresponding kind of problem with them, or punishments. And then Purgatorio, the second one, he's climbing up through the different plateaus of purgatory and purging the sins, and each of the sins has kind of like a corresponding kind of punishment to go along with it. And as he climbs each of the plateaus, he kind of is able to purge his sins. And then Paradiso, he's actually transcends and starts going up into the celestial bodies. And there's this understanding that the angels and the celestial realm is amongst the stars. So he's like ascending through the solar system, going to the moon, going to like Jupiter, Saturn, all the different celestial bodies, and each of them has like saints in them and corresponding virtues. What's interesting is that I think Dante was a geocentrist, because The first like spirit or two are like Mercury, and then the moon and Mercury, but then the sun is like the third or fourth sphere. And so I think he had a geocentric understanding of the universe, which is pretty interesting. And a little bit of background about Dante himself. So what's interesting about Dante is he basically he was embroiled. He was a partisan. He was embroiled in the politics of his day, and he put kind of his political enemies in the circles of hell, some of which who were still alive at the time when he wrote it, because he was exiled from Florence, Italy, which was his hometown, and he was exiled from there because he was a black Guelph. And the context of that is back in the 1300s, during the Holy Roman Empire, there was the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. And the Guelphs and the Ghibellines were kind of different partisan parties in Italy and Germany. And the Guelphs were in favor of more papal power, and the Ghibellines were more in favor of more king power, like more Holy Roman Emperor power. And so there's that's kind of like the story of Middle Age politics, is kind of that tension between the popes and the kings. And so the Guelphs and the Ghibellines fought many war, and it was like there were so many different city-states throughout Italy, and they're all fighting each other, and some of them like switched allegiances. Some of the city-states were Guelphs, some of them were Ghibellines, but eventually the Guelphs were able to come out on top at that particular time when Dante was around. But then the Guelphs who were in Florence had some infighting, and they split into the black Guelphs and the white Guelphs. And the black Guelphs were they were more aligned with the Ghibellines. They were against the Pope, specifically Pope Boniface VIII, and the white Guelphs were in favor of more papal temporal power. And this was kind of a major kind of question that was happening throughout the Middle Ages: is how much power does the Pope have? And Pope Boniface VIII in particular, who was the Pope during that time, he was in favor of the popes having a lot of temporal power. He sent mercenaries after people, and he was very involved in a lot of the politics of that day. And since Dante was a black Guelph, he got exiled from Florence, and so that's why Pope Boniface VIII is actually in hell in the Divine Comedy. So that's pretty nuts to think about, but he basically put the current Pope, in hell in his narrative. And it's like I think he is in the circle of hell for the simoniacs, which are the people who have basically bought holy items, or basically saying that he bought the papacy. But that's interesting to think. I mean, imagine if someone wrote a narrative where political figures of today were just in hell, like Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates, or Pope Francis, or whoever, Donald Trump is in the circle of hell for whatever, I think it's very polarizing. And I don't know, so Dante was clearly a partisan. A lot of people online, they view as like a negative thing or a flaw or just like alarming, but I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. I actually kind of think it's interesting that he put people in that day, because I would have never known about this kind of stuff had he not. And I don't know, it's like maybe he's making condemnations. Like, I don't know if he would say for certain, this guy is definitely going to hell, but he's like condemning people of his day. So I don't know. I guess I wouldn't condemn him being a partisan and putting people in hell who are currently alive. So another thing about Dante is that during his time, there was kind of the common status quo was to write any kind of intellectual work or academic stuff in Latin. That was kind of the universal understanding. But Dante, because he was kind of a black Guelph, he was kind of against the Pope. He actually chose to write the Divine Comedy in Italian, and he kind of deviated and rebelled against writing the Divine Comedy in Latin, because he was kind of a populist in favor of Italian, kind of the Italian language. And for that reason, the Divine Comedy was largely influential in terms of politics, but also in terms of language. And Dante is considered the father by many Italians the modern or the father of the Italian language. And the Divine Comedy is largely considered the greatest Italian poem ever, I believe. And I think it's an interesting thing because there's kind of a parallel today with, with the Latin Mass versus the Novus Ordo. And you see that tension back then as well between the written word, but also now we see it within the liturgy. So another question to ask is, what is like the actual impact of Dante's Divine Comedy besides the political sphere? And I'd say one of the biggest things is that it's kind of a synthesis of all the Greek and Roman myth with Christian cosmology. So there's many of the Greek and Roman mythological people from Greek myth in the different circles of hell. What's interesting too is he introduces this idea of limbo, where there is like the virtuous pagans, and there's the pagans who never knew Christ, but they're not quite good enough. They did the best of what they knew with the best of their abilities, and so there's a place for them. Like Aristotle and Socrates and many of the virtuous pagans are in this circle of hell called limbo, and it's kind of like they're not able to go to heaven, but they're in they're not like being tortured either. So this is kind of like a interesting point, for the person, the atheist I used to like question this. What about the guy, in the Amazon rainforest who has literally never heard of Jesus Christ or who has never heard of Christianity? Is that person going to go to hell? And the answer, according to Dante, is that no, they would be judged according to what they know, and God accounts for that, and maybe they'll end up somewhere else, like limbo. Another thing is that the idea that paganism kind of fits within the framework of Christianity, and all these Greek and mythological people are in the different circles of hell or purgatory or whatnot because it's like putting Christianity encompassing above paganism, which I think is true, which is why, the pagans easily embrace Christianity historically throughout Europe and, in the New World, because it fits with their viewpoint. It's not like the Christians just destroyed. It's just more like they have like the overarching thing, and it's like, oh, we can fit what we understand about the universe into this larger understanding of the truth. And a lot of like atheists are like, oh, it's syncretism, like, oh, Christianity is just like blending together with local customs. But God like allows the pagans and their cultures to have kind of some understanding, and so not all of it is bad either, and so some of those elements remain behind. And I'll get more into that into my next video on Christian lore and talk about Yule and the Christmas holiday and a lot of those traditions and those origins. But yeah, that's probably the biggest. And also another thing is that it just kind of creates concrete imagery about the Christian cosmology and the understanding of sin and the understanding of hell, heaven, and purgatory. And it kind of, having this rich imagery allows for people to understand a lot more of these theological points. Like, you don't have to study all the philosophy. Most people remember stories more so than like abstract ideas. So that's probably the biggest impact. It's also impacted cinema quite a bit. I know a lot of our depiction of hell is very influenced by the Divine Comedy, and there's many movies that are influenced by the Divine Comedy. There are a few key themes as well, such as God is perfectly just. For example, Dante, when he first enters into hell, he is feeling bad for the different people who are condemned in hell. But Virgil kind of corrects him and says that, oh, wait, maybe you actually need to realize that God is perfectly just. And it's actually disordered to, if God is perfectly just and you're questioning God's judgment, that means that you don't actually believe that God's perfectly just. So that's kind of one thing that Dante intellectually progresses throughout Inferno. And also you see a lot of Dante's character progression throughout Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. another thing is when he's journeying in Paradiso up to God, up through the different layers. His eyes, it's like it's too bright for him. He can't like see things. Like he looks at like Beatrice's smile, and he's like blinded. He can't like comprehend, and so it's this understanding that we are not able to properly comprehend or handle the majesty of God, because like our eyes, we're just like it. We just like ease into it in the same way that, you know, when you walk outside after being in a dark room, your eyes are just like, you can't see anything. You can't, in the same way, like that's how heaven is, and that's how God is. We have to kind of gradually be able to adjust our eyes to be able to understand and comprehend even God's glory, and that's pretty crazy to think about. Another thing is, yeah, just the general understanding of Christian cosmology and a lot of different Christian understandings of sin and different things. That's all very, very valuable stuff. So that's why I think everyone should read this book eventually. It is a grind, it's a commitment, but it's definitely excites the imagination as well, which I think is a good thing. So yeah, I definitely was demoralized in not being able to understand a lot of the stuff in this book, but I'm glad I finally got through it, and I took some time to kind of process it and do some reading on it, and yeah, I'm glad that I did. So if you guys like this kind of content, maybe I'll do an Iliad video in the future, but the next video I'm going to do is I'm going to be talking about the Christmas lore and talking about Yuletide, talking about the origin of like mistletoe, talking about the origin of Santa Claus, that kind of thing. That'll be the next video. So if you like this kind of content, then subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment. And I hope you guys like this video. I'll see you in the next one.